The dust never settled in Copper Valley. It hung in the air like a curse, coating everything in a fine layer of rust-colored grit that made the whole world look like it was slowly dying. Marcus Sullivan stood on the porch of his crumbling ranch house, watching the sun bleed orange across the desert horizon, and wondered how much longer he could pretend this place was still worth fighting for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter in his back pocket felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Third notice from the bank. Final demand. 30 days to come up with $12,000 or lose everything his grandfather had built. With his bare hands and a prayer, Marcus rubbed his face with calloused hands, tasting the salt of his own sweat mixed with the ever-present dust. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Still standing out here like a scarecrow, Marcus didn't turn around. He knew that voice belonged to Pete Hawkins, his only remaining ranch hand and the closest thing to family he had left. Pete was pushing 70, with hands like tree roots, and a loyalty that Marcus had never quite figured out how to deserve. Bank called again. Marcus said, watching a hawk circle something dead in the distance. Same song, different verse. Pete spat into the dirt. Vultures, a lot of them. Your granddad built this place when there wasn't nothing but rattlesnakes and tumbleweeds for 50 miles in any direction. Granddad didn't have to compete with corporate ranches and a drought that lasted 3 years. Marcus finally turned to face the old man. Face it, Pete, we're done. I'm done. The words tasted like copper pennies in his mouth. 2 years ago, Marcus Sullivan had been somebody, not rich, but comfortable. He'd had 100 head of cattle, decent grazing land, and a woman who'd promised to marry him come spring. Then the drought hit, followed by a cattle disease that wiped out half his herd. Sarah packed her bags on a Tuesday morning and was gone by Wednesday, leaving nothing but a note about how she couldn't watch him throw his life away on a lost cause. Now Marcus spent his days fixing fence posts for neighbors who paid him in cash, under the table, patching up water troughs that never seemed to hold enough, and lying awake at night listening to the wind rattle the loose boards of a house that felt more like a tomb with each passing month. You remember when you were 8 years old, Pete said, settling his weight against the porch railing, and that storm knocked down the big oak by the creek. Marcus sighed. Pete, I'm not in the mood for, you cried for 3 days straight. Said that tree was the only shade for miles and now everything was going to die. Your granddad, he set you down right here on this porch and told you something I never forgot. Despite himself, Marcus found his attention caught. Pete rarely talked about the past, especially anything involving his grandfather. He said, boy, sometimes the strongest trees get knocked down so something better can grow in their place. But first, you got to clear away all the dead wood. Pete's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe you got to lose everything before you can find out what you're really made of. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to tell Pete that philosophical bullshit wouldn't pay the mortgage or bring back the cattle, or fill the empty spaces in a house built for a family he'd never have. But before he could open his mouth, the sound of an engine cut through the evening air. A black sedan was making its way up the long dirt road that led to the ranch, moving too fast for the rough terrain and kicking up a plume of dust that stretched behind it. Like a signal fire, Marcus frowned. Nobody came out here anymore unless they were lost or bringing bad news. The car pulled to a stop near the porch and 3 people climbed out. The first was a woman in her 50s, dressed in a dark blue suit that had probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face had the kind of hardness that came from years of getting exactly what she wanted. Behind her came a younger man, maybe 35, with soft hands and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. The third person was older, a man with gray hair and the kind of eyes that seemed to be calculating the value of everything they looked at. Mr. Sullivan, the woman stepped forward, her heels clicking against the wooden steps. My name is Victoria Hensley. These are my associates, Mr. David Hensley and Mr. Charles Brennan. Marcus nodded but didn't move from where he stood. Help you with something? Victoria's smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. "We have a business proposition that might interest you. May we come inside?" "Depends on what kind of business you're talking about." The woman named Victoria glanced at her companions, and something passed between them that Marcus couldn't quite read. "The kind that could solve your financial difficulties, Mr. Sullivan. We're prepared to offer you $5,000 for a simple service." By noon, his shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the October chill, and his hands were raw even through his work gloves. The grave was maybe 3 feet deep, still nowhere near finished, when he heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 2 cars this time, the black sedan from yesterday, followed by a white panel van with no markings on the sides. Marcus climbed out of the hole and waited, shovel in hand, as the small convoy pulled to a stop about 20 yards away. Victoria Hensley emerged from the sedan first, dressed in the same severe style as before, but now wearing dark sunglasses. That hid her eyes completely. Behind her came David Hensley and Charles Brennan, both looking uncomfortable in the desert heat. From the van came 2 men Marcus didn't recognize, younger, broader, with the kind of casual menace that suggested they weren't here for their conversational skills. "Mr. Sullivan," Victoria nodded toward the partially dug grave. "I see you've decided to accept our offer. Seemed like the practical choice," Marcus replied, though something in his gut was already screaming that practical and right weren't the same thing. Victoria gestured toward the van. "Excellent. Shall we proceed?" One of the newcomers, a thick-necked man with forearms like tree trunks, opened the back doors of the van. Marcus expected to see a coffin, or at least a body bag. Instead, there was a stretcher with what looked like a person wrapped in a white sheet, but the shape was wrong. Too small, too still, and there was something about the way the sheet clung to the form underneath that made Marcus's throat go dry. "That's her?" he asked. "That's her," Victoria confirmed. "Elena Hensley, my son's wife. Was my son's wife, I should say." The 2 men lifted the stretcher from the van with mechanical efficiency, carrying it toward the grave like they'd done this before. As they got closer, Marcus could see more details that made his stomach clench. The sheet wasn't just wrapped around a body, it was bound tight with rope at several points, like someone had been concerned about movement, and there was something dark staining the fabric near what would have been the head. "Hold on," Marcus said, stepping forward. "What exactly happened to her?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but David Hensley shifted uncomfortably. "As I mentioned yesterday, it was an accident, a fall down the stairs, very tragic. Falls downstairs don't usually require ropes." Charles Brennan stepped forward, with that calculating look in his eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, sometimes the recently deceased can shift during transport. It's simply a matter of dignity." Marcus stared at the shrouded form. Even from several feet away, he could see that whoever was under that sheet was small-boned, probably young. The rope bindings were tight enough to leave indentations in the fabric, and there was something about the whole arrangement that felt less like respectful handling of the dead, and more like someone making sure a package couldn't come unwrapped. "I want to see her," Marcus said. The silence that followed was heavy enough to taste. Victoria's lips compressed into a thin line, and the 2 muscle-bound men flanking the stretcher tensed like coiled springs. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Victoria said finally. "There was significant trauma, and frankly, it would be disturbing for someone unfamiliar with such things, lady. I've been ranching for 15 years. I've seen cattle torn apart by coyotes, and horses kicked in the head by other horses. I don't disturb easy. Nevertheless, if you want me to bury her, I will see her first. That's not negotiable." Victoria and Charles Brennan exchanged a look that lasted several seconds too long. Finally, Victoria nodded curtly. "Very well, but I warn you, Mr. Sullivan, this is not something you'll want to remember." One of the men set down his end of the stretcher and began untying the rope at what Marcus assumed was the head end. The sheet fell away, and Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. The woman underneath couldn't have been more than 25. Dark hair, pale skin, and a face that would have been beautiful if not for the purple bruising around her throat, and the dried blood caked in her hairline. Her lips were blue-tinged, and her eyes were closed, but there was something wrong with The way her chest moved, a barely perceptible rise and fall that shouldn't have been there. If she was really dead. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed. She's breathing. Nonsense, Victoria said sharply. Postmortem muscle spasms. Perfectly normal. But Marcus was already moving. Dropping to his knees beside the stretcher, he pressed his ear close to the woman's mouth and felt the faintest whisper of warm air against his cheek. Her lips were moving, just slightly, forming soundless words. She's alive, he said, straightening up fast enough to make his head spin. This woman is alive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The reaction was immediate and telling. Victoria stepped backward, her hand moving toward her purse. David Hensley went pale and started to stammer something about impossible mistakes. Charles Brennan simply watched Marcus with the cold attention of a snake deciding whether to strike. But it was the two muscle-bound men who confirmed what Marcus had already begun to suspect. They moved with the fluid precision of people who'd been expecting this exact moment, flanking him before he'd even fully registered the threat. Mr. Sullivan. Victoria's voice had dropped all pretense of grief or family tragedy. I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation. Marcus looked down. And Elena, he could see now that's what this was really about. Not some family member who died accidentally. This young woman was supposed to be murdered, and he was supposed to be the one who finished the job. Let me guess, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. This isn't about a tragic accident. This is about making sure Elena Hensley disappears. Permanently. Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. Elena was always too curious for her own good. She started asking questions about her husband's death, about certain financial irregularities in the family business. Some questions are better left unasked, so you decided to bury her alive. We decided to solve a problem, Charles Brennan said matter-of-factly. You were simply meant to be the solution. Unfortunately, you've proven more observant than we anticipated. Marcus looked around at the 5 people surrounding him, and the young woman who was fighting for her life on the stretcher between them. The nearest road was a quarter-mile away. His truck was parked behind the van, and he was outnumbered 5-1 by people who'd clearly planned for multiple contingencies. What now? He asked. Now, Victoria said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small pistol. You finished digging that grave, but I'm afraid it's going to need to be quite a bit larger than originally planned. Marcus felt the weight of the shovel in his hands. It wasn't much of a weapon against 5 people, but it was what he had, and looking down at Elena's bruised face, at the way her chest moved with each struggling breath, he realized that sometimes having something was enough. No, he said quietly. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's eyebrows rose above her sunglasses. I beg your pardon, I said no. I'm not digging any more graves, and I'm sure as hell not burying anyone alive. One of the muscle-bound men stepped closer, his hand moving toward something under his jacket. Maybe you need some encouragement. Marcus shifted his grip on the shovel, calculating distances and angles. He'd never been in a real fight in his life, but he'd spent 15 years swinging tools and moving hay bales and wrestling cattle. He might not win, but he could make it expensive. Marcus. The voice was so soft he almost missed it. Elena's eyes had opened, just barely, and she was looking at him with an expression that was equal parts terror and desperate hope. Help me. The words were barely more than a whisper, but they hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't about money anymore, or saving his ranch, or any of the desperate calculations that had brought him here. This was about a young woman who was about to be murdered, and whether he was the kind of man who could stand by and let that happen. He thought about his grandfather, about the oak tree and dead wood and things that had to be cleared away before something better could grow. Maybe Pete had been right. Maybe he needed to lose everything to find out what he was really made of. Marcus raised the shovel and took a step backward, putting himself between Elena and the 5 people who wanted her dead. Lady, he said to Victoria, you picked the wrong man for this job. What happened next came fast and ugly. The first muscle-bound man lunged forward, and Marcus swung the shovel like a baseball bat, catching him across the temple with the flat of the blade. The man dropped like a sack of grain, and Victoria started screaming something about stupid cowboys and necessary sacrifices. The second man was quicker, getting inside Marcus's swing and landing a punch that split his lip and filled his mouth with the taste of copper. But Marcus had spent his whole life working with his hands, and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he had. He drove the handle of the shovel into the man's solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought his knee up into the man's face. David Hensley was fumbling for something in his jacket, his soft hands shaking. Charles Brennan was moving toward the van, probably going for a bigger gun or more help. And Victoria was raising her pistol with the cold precision of someone who'd done this before. Marcus dove sideways, rolling behind the stretcher as the first shot cracked across the desert air. The bullet whined off a rock somewhere behind him, and Elena made a small sound that might have been his name. He had maybe 5 seconds before they repositioned for a clear shot. 5 seconds to figure out how to save a woman he'd never met, in a place where no one would hear the gunshots, against people who clearly had experience making problems disappear. Marcus looked at Elena's face, at the trust in her barely open eyes, and realized that sometimes 5 seconds was all the time in the world, if you knew how to use them right. The second gunshot shattered the silence as Marcus grabbed the stretcher and rolled it behind his truck, using the vehicle as cover. Elena's eyes were wide now, more alert than they'd been moments before, and she was trying to speak through what looked like the lingering effects of whatever they'd used to drug her. "Can you move?" Marcus whispered, crouched beside her behind the truck's rear wheel. She managed a slight nod, her voice barely audible. "Legs heavy, can't feel." "They drugged you," Marcus said, keeping his eyes on the gap between the truck and the van where he could see Charles Brennan moving. "But you're alive, and that's what matters." Victoria's voice cut across the desert air, sharp and commanding. "Mr. Sullivan, there's no need for this to become more complicated than it already is. Simply walk away, and we'll consider this a misunderstanding." Marcus almost laughed. A misunderstanding, like he'd accidentally stumbled into a murder plot instead of being hired to carry it out. But he could hear something else in Victoria's tone and certainty. They'd planned for him to be an unwitting accomplice, not an active opponent. Now they were improvising, and improvisation led to mistakes. "Elena," he whispered, helping her sit up against the truck's tailgate. "I need to know what you know. Why do they want you dead?" Her hands were shaking, but she managed to grip his arm. "Thomas, my husband, he didn't die in an accident." Each word seemed to cost her enormous effort. "I found papers, Victoria and Charles. They've been stealing from the family trust, millions." Marcus felt a cold understanding settle in his chest. This wasn't just about family disputes or inheritance battles. This was about corporate theft on a massive scale, and Elena had discovered evidence that could destroy them all. "Where are the papers now?" "Safety deposit box. First National Bank, Riverside." She closed her eyes, fighting against whatever was still in her system. "Thomas found out. They killed him. Made it look like heart attack." Another shot rang out, this one closer. A chunk of metal exploded from the truck's bumper, sending shrapnel spinning into the dirt. Marcus could hear movement boots on gravel, low voices coordinating positions. They were being surrounded. "Mr. Sullivan." This time, it was David Hensley's voice, high and nervous. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. This is family business." "Murdering your sister-in-law isn't family business," Marcus called back. "It's what they call first-degree murder in most places." He needed to think, needed a plan that went beyond hiding behind a truck until they got brave enough to rush him. The van was parked between them and the main road, cutting off the most obvious escape route. But Marcus had grown up in this desert, had spent countless hours exploring the old mining roads and cattle trails that crisscrossed the valley. There were other ways out. If he could get Elena mobile enough to move. "Listen to me," he said quietly, pulling off his work shirt and wrapping it around Elena's shoulders. "About 100 yards that way, there's an old mining trail that cuts through the rocks. If we can get to my truck and start driving, I can get us out of here." Elena's eyes focused on his face with obvious effort. "They'll follow. Let me worry about that." Marcus pulled his keys from his pocket and pressed them into her hand. On my signal, you crawl to the driver's side door and get in. Keep your head down and start the engine. Can you do that? She nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. Fear mixed with something else, a determination that suggested Victoria Hensley had seriously underestimated the woman she was trying to kill. What about you? Elena asked. Marcus picked up the shovel again, testing its weight. I'm going to buy us some time. Before she could protest, Marcus stood up and stepped out from behind the truck. Victoria and her men had spread out in a rough semicircle, trying to cut off any escape routes. The first man he'd hit with the shovel was sitting on the ground, holding his head and looking dazed. The second was back on his feet, but moving carefully, one hand pressed to his ribs. All right, Marcus called out, raising his hands but keeping the shovel visible. You want to talk about this? Let's talk. Victoria lowered her pistol slightly, though she kept it ready. Sensible. I knew you were a practical man, Mr. Sullivan. Practical enough to know when I'm outgunned, Marcus said, taking a slow step forward. But I've got some questions before we work out terms. Questions? Charles Brennan emerged from behind the van, also holding a gun. This isn't a negotiation. Maybe not, but I'm curious about something. Marcus took another step, closing the distance between them. See, I've been thinking about why you came to me specifically. Why not hire professional killers? Why not just make Elena disappear in some city where nobody knows her? Victoria's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses. Your point, my point, is that you needed someone local, someone who knows the land, someone who could bury her where she'd never be found. Which tells me you're planning to stick around Copper Valley for a while. Probably got more business to take care of. Marcus was close enough now to see the perspiration on David Hensley's forehead, close enough to notice how Charles Brennan's hand trembled slightly as he held his weapon. These people were dangerous, but they weren't professional killers. They were white-collar criminals who'd gotten in over their heads. But here's what I don't understand. Marcus continued, shifting his weight slightly. If Elena's got evidence that could destroy you, why not just steal it? Why go straight to murder? The question hit home. He could see it in the way Victoria's jaw tightened, in the way David Hensley's eyes darted toward his mother, because Elena's voice came from behind the truck, stronger now. They don't know where all the evidence is. Marcus smiled grimly. She made copies, didn't she? Spread them around. Smart girl. Smart enough to be a problem. Victoria said coldly, but not smart enough to stay quiet. And now you've got a bigger problem, Marcus said, because I know about it too. That was when he moved. Marcus had spent years wielding a shovel, and his grandfather had taught him that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to make sure it happened on your terms. He lunged forward, not at Victoria with her gun, but at David Hensley, who was closer and looked the most nervous. The younger man yelped and stumbled backward as Marcus swung the shovel in a wide arc, forcing both Charles, Brennan, and Victoria to move or risk hitting David with their shots. In the chaos that followed, shouting, the sound of boots scrambling on gravel, another gunshot that went wide. Marcus heard the sweetest sound in the world, his truck's engine roaring to life. Go, he shouted, diving behind the van as bullets started flying in earnest. Elena had managed to get the truck moving, spinning gravel as she pulled away from their attackers, but she was driving erratically, still fighting the effects of whatever they'd drugged her with, and Marcus could see she wasn't going to make it far without help. The injured muscle man was trying to get to his feet, blood streaming from his nose. Charles Brennan was reloading his pistol with shaking hands. Victoria was screaming orders about stopping the truck, about cleaning up this mess, about how everything was falling apart. Marcus looked around for another weapon, another angle, another way to turn the situation in his favor. That's when he spotted something he'd missed before: a red jerrycan tucked behind the van's rear wheel. Gasoline, probably for the generator they'd brought to run power tools if the digging had taken longer than expected. Sometimes the best plans were the simplest ones. Marcus grabbed the gas can and started splashing fuel across the van's tires and undercarriage. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and chemical. Victoria noticed what he was doing just as he pulled out his lighter, a battered Zippo. his grandfather had carried in Vietnam. "Stop," she screamed. "Are you insane?" "Just practical," Marcus said, flicking the lighter open. "You want to keep shooting at me, go ahead. But this whole thing's going up in flames, and your ride home goes with it." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like an hour. Marcus could see his truck in the distance, Elena having managed to get it about a quarter mile away. Before it veered off the road and stopped, she was probably unconscious again, or close to it. He needed to get to her, but first he needed to make sure these people couldn't follow. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his thumb on the lighter's striker wheel. "You're going to drop your weapons and step away from the van. Then you're going to walk back toward the main road. By the time you flag down help and get back here, Elena and I will be long gone." "You're making a mistake, Sullivan Charles," Brennan said, but he was already lowering his gun. "We have resources you can't imagine. Connections, we'll find you." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but you'll have to do it without transportation." He flicked the lighter and dropped it onto the gasoline-soaked ground. The flames caught immediately, racing along the fuel lines he'd created and engulfing the van's rear end in a pillar of orange fire. The explosion, when it came, knocked everyone flat and sent a column of black smoke spiraling into the desert sky. Marcus was already running, his ears ringing from the blast, his lungs burning from the smoke and exertion. Behind him, he could hear Victoria Hensley screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. But the important thing was that she was screaming them from a quarter mile away. With no way to follow, his truck was sitting at an angle in a shallow wash, steam rising from its hood. Elena was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. Marcus checked her pulse steady, but weak, then gently moved her to the passenger seat and took over driving. As they pulled away, heading for one of the old mining roads that would take them back towards civilization by a route the Hensley family couldn't possibly know, Marcus caught sight of the smoke column in his rearview mirror. It was visible for miles, a black stain against the blue desert sky. By evening, half the county would know something had happened out there. The Hensley family would have to come up with explanations, deal with questions, figure out how to spin a story that didn't involve attempted murder and buried bodies. But for now, Marcus had bought them time for Elena to recover, time to figure out their next move, time to turn the evidence she'd gathered into protection instead of a death sentence. As they drove deeper into the desert, following roads that existed more as suggestions than actual paths, Elena stirred in the passenger seat, her eyes opened, unfocused but aware. Did we get away?" she whispered. Marcus looked at her, this woman he'd pulled back from death, the stranger who'd become his responsibility in the space of a few desperate hours, and felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe Pete had been right about dead wood and new growth. Maybe sometimes you had to burn everything down before you could build something better. "We got away," he said, "but this isn't over, not by a long shot." Elena nodded weakly, then closed her eyes again. Thomas used to say, "When you find something worth protecting, you protect it no matter what." Marcus thought about his failing ranch, about the bank notices in his pocket, about the life he'd been trying so desperately to save. Funny how none of that seemed to matter anymore. He'd found something worth protecting, all right. The question now was whether he was strong enough to see it through to the end. In the distance, the smoke from the burning van continued to rise, a signal fire visible for miles round. It was a message, Marcus realized, to the Hensley family, to anyone else who might be watching. To himself, some things were worth fighting for, and Marcus Sullivan had finally found something worth the fight. The abandoned mining office sat like a forgotten gravestone against the rust-colored cliffs, its windows long since shattered and its roof sagging under decades of desert weather. Marcus had discovered it years ago while tracking strays, and now it served as the perfect hideout, close enough to civilization to matter, remote enough that the Hensley family would never think to look there. Elena had been unconscious for most of the 6-hour drive through back roads and cattle trails that existed more in Marcus's memory than on any map. Whatever they'd used to drug her was potent stuff, but by the time he'd carried her into the shelter of the old building, her breathing had steadied and some color had returned to her face. Now, 18 hours later, she was sitting on a makeshift bed of old blankets Pete had brought from the ranch, sipping coffee from a thermos and looking more like a living person than a corpse. The bruises around her throat had darkened to deep purple, and her movements were still careful, deliberate, but her eyes were sharp and focused. "Tell me about Thomas," Marcus said, settling down across from her with his own cup of coffee. Pete was outside, keeping watch and maintaining the generator they'd brought to power a small space heater. "Tell me how this whole thing started." Elena stared into her coffee for a long moment, as if she could read the future in the dark liquid. When she spoke, her voice was steady but distant, like she was recounting someone else's story. "I met Thomas at a charity auction in Phoenix 2 years ago. He was different from what I expected. The Hensley family has this reputation for being ruthless in business, but Thomas was gentle, kind. He actually cared about the charities we were supporting, not just the tax write-offs." She paused, touching the bruises on her neck unconsciously. "His mother hated me from the moment we met, said I was after the family money, that I didn't understand their world. The funny thing is, she was half right. I didn't understand their world. I just didn't realize how dark it really was." Marcus refilled her cup from the thermos. "When did you start to suspect something was wrong?" "About 6 months ago. Thomas had been acting strange, nervous, secretive. He'd always been involved in the family business, but suddenly he was asking me questions about accounting, about what I knew about financial audits. My background is in forensic accounting, so I thought maybe he was just picking my brain about something routine. That explained a lot. Victoria Hensley hadn't just married her son to a random woman. She'd married him to someone with the exact skills needed to uncover their theft. Talk about ironic justice. Then Thomas started staying late at the office, bringing home boxes of files. He said he was working on a special project for the board of directors, something about streamlining their charitable giving. But the papers I saw," Elena shook her head, "they weren't about charity. They were bank records, investment, portfolios, trust fund distributions going back 15 years. What did you find?" Elena reached into the pocket of the jacket Pete had brought her and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting and columns of numbers. The Hensley Family Trust was established in 1987 by Thomas's grandfather. It was supposed to fund education scholarships, medical research, and community development projects, legitimate charity work that would benefit thousands of people. She opened the notebook and showed Marcus pages of calculations, transfer records, and what looked like bank routing numbers. But starting in 2010, right after Thomas's father died and Victoria took over as trustee, the money started disappearing. Small amounts at first, maybe $50,000 here and there, disguised as administrative costs or consultant fees. But over the years, it escalated. Marcus studied the numbers, though most of the financial terminology was beyond him. "How much are we talking about?" As of last month, Victoria and Charles have stolen nearly $8 million from the trust. They've been funneling it through shell companies, fake consulting firms, even a bogus art collection that exists only on paper. The scholarship recipients, the medical research grants, the community projects, they've all been getting pennies on the dollar, while Victoria and Charles pocket the rest. The scope of it was staggering. Marcus had grown up around ranch families who struggled to make ends meet, who counted every dollar and worked 16-hour days just to keep food on the table. The idea that someone would steal $8 million from charities designed to help people was almost incomprehensible. Thomas figured this out. Thomas figured it out and confronted his mother about it. They had a huge fight. The whole house could hear it. Victoria claimed it was all legal, that she was just redirecting funds to more efficient programs. But Thomas had documentation showing exactly where the money went, into personal accounts, luxury purchases, investments that had nothing to do with charity. Elena's hands were trembling slightly as she held the notebook. 3 days later, Thomas had his heart attack. He was 31 years old, Marcus. No family history of heart problems, perfect health, exercised regularly. But the coroner said it was a massive coronary event, probably brought on by stress. "You didn't believe it." "I didn't believe it, but I also couldn't prove anything." Victoria made all the funeral arrangements, handled all the paperwork, even had Thomas cremated before I could request an autopsy. She said it was what he would have wanted, a simple ceremony without a lot of fuss. Marcus thought about the cold calculation in Victoria Hensley's eyes, the way she'd ordered Elena's murder like she was discussing the weather. A woman capable of that was certainly capable of killing her own son. So you started investigating. On your own, I started asking questions about the trust, about Thomas's work, about why he'd been so worried in the weeks before he died. Victoria tried to shut me down, said I was being disrespectful to his memory. That grief was making me paranoid. But I kept digging. Elena turned to a different page in the notebook, this one filled with names, dates, and what looked like transaction records. I found proof, Marcus. Bank records showing transfers from the trust into personal accounts, invoices for services that were never performed, purchase orders for equipment that was never delivered. And I found something else. She pulled a folded piece of paper from the back of the notebook and handed it to Marcus. It was a copy of a life insurance policy, and the numbers on it made his eyes widen. Thomas had a $10 million life insurance policy. Victoria is the beneficiary. Marcus stared at the document. She killed her own son for money. She killed her own son to cover up the fact that she'd been stealing money and to collect $10 million in insurance on top of it. But there was one problem. Thomas had changed his will shortly before he died. Instead of leaving everything to his mother, he left it all to me, including his stake in the family business and his position on the trust's board of directors. The pieces were falling into place now. Victoria hadn't just lost a son, she'd lost control of the trust and gained a daughter-in-law with both the skills and the legal authority to expose everything she'd done. So she decided to get rid of you too. She tried the legal route first, contested the will, claimed Thomas wasn't in his right mind when he signed it, even accused me of coercing him. But the will was ironclad, and I had witnesses to prove Thomas was thinking clearly when he made the changes. Elena closed the notebook and looked directly at Marcus. That's when the accident started. A gas leak in my apartment that could have killed me if I hadn't smelled it in time. A hit-and-run driver who missed me by inches. Someone broke into my car and cut the brake lines. But I noticed the fluid leak before I drove anywhere. Why didn't you go to the police? I tried, but the Hensley family has connections everywhere: law enforcement, politicians, judges. Every time I filed a report, it disappeared into paperwork. Every detective I spoke to suddenly got reassigned to other cases. Charles Brennan used to be a federal prosecutor before he went into private practice. He knows exactly how to make problems disappear. Marcus understood now why they'd tried to make Elena's death look like a disappearance rather than a murder. No body, no investigation. Just a grieving widow who'd apparently decided to start a new life somewhere else, leaving behind all her accusations and evidence. But you were smarter than they gave you credit for. Elena smiled for the first time since he'd met her, and Marcus was struck by how it transformed her entire face. Despite everything she'd been through, there was still fight left in her. I made copies of everything. The bank records, the insurance policy, Thomas's notes about the missing money, even recordings of some of the conversations I had with Victoria where she threatened me. I put together a complete file documenting 15 years of theft and at least one murder, and that file is in the safety deposit box at First National Bank. That file is insurance. As long as it exists, I'm too dangerous to kill quietly, which is why they decided to make me disappear instead. Elena's expression darkened. They hired you because they thought you were just a desperate rancher who'd do anything for money. They didn't count on you having a conscience. Marcus thought about the man he'd been just 2 days ago, bitter, isolated, ready to do almost anything to save a failing ranch. It felt like a lifetime ago. What's our next move? He asked. We get to that safety deposit box before they figure out where it is. Then we take everything to the FBI field office in Phoenix and hope we find someone who can't be bought. Pete's voice called from outside, low and urgent. Marcus, company coming. Marcus was on his feet immediately, moving to the window. In the distance, He could see a dust plume rising from the old mining road, multiple vehicles moving fast toward their position. How did they find us? Elena asked, but she was already gathering her things. Marcus grabbed the binoculars Pete had brought and focused on the approaching vehicles. 3 cars, moving in formation, kicking up enough dust to be visible for miles. Professional pursuit, not random discovery. They didn't find us, he said grimly. They found my truck. He should have thought of it earlier. GPS tracking, cell phone signals, any number of ways the Hensley family's resources could have traced them. Charles Brennan hadn't been a federal prosecutor for nothing. He knew how to hunt people. How long do we have? Elena asked. Marcus checked his watch and estimated the distance. Maybe 10 minutes. Is there another way out of here? Marcus looked at Pete, who was already pointing toward the back of the mining office. Old service tunnel leads down into the canyon. Comes out about a mile south, near where we used to run cattle. But it's going to be rough going, especially for someone who's still recovering from whatever they drugged you with. Elena was already moving toward the tunnel entrance. I'll manage. As they gathered their essential supplies and prepared to disappear into the desert once again, Marcus realized that Victoria Hensley had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd thought that killing Thomas and Elena would solve her problems, but instead she'd created enemies who had nothing left to lose. And enemies with nothing left to lose were the most dangerous kind of all. The sound of engines was getting closer now, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Whatever happened next, Marcus knew there was no going back to his old life. He'd crossed a line when he chose to save Elena instead of burying her, and now he was committed to seeing this through to whatever end awaited them. But as they disappeared into the darkness of the old mining tunnel, with the sound of their pursuers growing louder behind them, Marcus found himself thinking about something Pete had said about dead wood and new growth. Maybe some things had to be completely destroyed before they could be rebuilt into something better. Maybe that's exactly what was happening here. The mining tunnel reeked of bat guano and decades of stagnant air, but it was better than being shot full of holes by Victoria Hensley's hunting party. Marcus led the way with a flashlight, followed by Elena, with Pete bringing up the rear and periodically stopping to listen for sounds of pursuit. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, following an old ore vein that had played out some time in the 1940s. How much farther? Elena whispered. The effects of whatever they'd drugged her with were mostly gone, but the physical exertion was taking its toll. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she was breathing harder than she should have. Ben, maybe half a mile, Marcus replied, keeping his voice low. The tunnel connects to a natural cave system that comes out in Deadman's Canyon from there. We can reach my neighbor's ranch. Behind them, Pete suddenly held up his hand for silence. They all froze, listening. Faint echoes drifted down the tunnel, voices, footsteps, the scrape of boots on stone. The Hensley team had found the tunnel entrance. Move, Marcus urged, and they picked up the pace despite the treacherous footing and low ceiling that forced them to duck walk in places. The tunnel widened as they went deeper, opening into a series of natural chambers carved out by ancient water flow. Marcus had explored these caves as a teenager, back when his biggest worry was whether he'd finished his algebra homework. Now he was leading a woman with evidence of an $8 million theft through underground passages while armed killers hunted them in the darkness. They emerged from the tunnel system 40 minutes later, blinking in the late afternoon sunlight at the bottom of a narrow canyon. The walls rose 50 feet on either side, creating natural cover but also limiting their escape routes. Marcus checked his watch for 30 p.m. They had maybe 3 hours of daylight left there. Pete pointed toward the canyon's mouth, where a dirt road was barely visible through the scrub brush that leads to Whitmore Place. Jake's been running cattle here for 30 years, knows every rock and cactus for 20 miles round. As they started toward the road, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold, the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Victoria Hensley wasn't just using ground teams anymore. She'd called in air support. They've got a chopper, he said, grabbing Elena's arm and pulling her toward a cluster of boulders that would provide overhead cover. How the hell does a charity trustee get access to helicopters? Charles Brennan has law enforcement contacts, Elena said, pressing herself against the rocks as the sound grew louder. He probably told them I'm a fugitive, that I killed Thomas and stole money from the trust. They might even have a warrant. The helicopter appeared over the canyon rim, black against the blue sky, circling like a mechanical vulture. It wasn't a police aircraft, no markings, no identification numbers visible. This was private security, the kind that asked no questions as long as the money was good. They're tracking us somehow, Pete said, studying the aircraft's search pattern. GPS, maybe, or thermal imaging. Marcus thought about their situation tactically. The helicopter gave their pursuers a massive advantage: speed, mobility, and a bird's-eye view of the entire area. On foot, in open country, they were sitting ducks. We need to split up, he said. Draw them in different directions. No, Elena's voice was firm. We stay together. I won't let you risk your life for evidence I collected. That evidence is the only thing keeping you alive, Marcus pointed out. If they catch us before we can get it to the FBI, then we make sure they don't catch us. The helicopter was circling lower now, its downdraft kicking up dust and debris. Marcus could see figures rappelling from its cargo door, professional operators in tactical gear, moving with the precision of ex-military. Victoria Hensley had definitely upgraded her resources since the desert confrontation. This way, Pete said, pointing toward a narrow crack in the canyon wall. Old bootlegger's cave from Prohibition days. Goes back about a quarter mile, too narrow for them to follow. US in bulk. They squeezed through the opening just as the first tactical team members reached the canyon floor. The cave was pitch black and barely wide enough for a single person, but it led deeper into the rock face where helicopter surveillance couldn't reach them. Marcus's flashlight beam revealed a surprising sight. The cave had been modified years ago, with wooden support beams and even some old furniture scattered around. Empty whiskey bottles lined makeshift shelves, and faded photographs showed groups of men in 1920s clothing, posing with stills and barrels. Jake's grandfather ran moonshine through here, Pete explained, settling down on an old wooden crate. Federal agents raided the place 3 times and never found this cave. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Elena was examining the photographs with interest. These men look like they were running a substantial operation. How much money do you think they made? Enough to buy off half the law enforcement in 3 counties, Pete said. Corruption's nothing new around here. It just wears better clothes these days. Outside, they could hear voices echoing off the canyon walls, radio chatter, tactical communications, the sound of organized professionals conducting a methodical search. Marcus estimated at least 6 or 8 operators, plus air support. Victoria Hensley was taking no chances this time. We can't stay here forever, Marcus said. Eventually they'll bring in ground-penetrating radar or heat sensors. We need a plan that gets us to Riverside and that safety deposit box. Elena pulled out her notebook and showed him a hand-drawn map. I've been thinking about that. The bank closes at 5 p.m. on weekdays, doesn't reopen until 9 a.m. But I have a friend who works there, Sarah Chen, assistant manager. If I can get her a message, she might be willing to meet us after hours. That's a big if, and a big risk for your friend. Sarah was Thomas's college roommate. She knows something was wrong about his death, and she's been asking questions the family didn't want answered. She'd help us if she could. Marcus studied the map. Riverside was 40 miles away, mostly through open country where a helicopter could track them easily. But there was another route through the old cattle trails that wound through the foothills, using terrain that would mask their movement and force any pursuit to come on foot. Pete, you know those mountain trails better than anyone. Could we get to Riverside without using the main roads? The old rancher nodded slowly. Take most of the night, and it'd be rough going. But yeah, it's possible. There's an old mining camp up near Copper Peak, abandoned for 50 years. We could hole up there until dark, then make our move. The sound of the helicopter was fading, but Marcus could still hear voices in the canyon. The search teams were being thorough, checking every possible hiding spot. They had training and equipment, but Marcus had something they didn't: intimate knowledge of land his family had worked for 3 generations. All right, he said. We wait until they move on. then head for the mining camp from there. We make contact with your friend at the bank and figure out how to get that evidence. And then, Elena asked, then we take down Victoria Hensley and everyone who helped her. They settled into wait, listening to the search teams work their way through the canyon below. Marcus found himself studying Elena in the dim light from his flashlight, trying to understand how someone so young had gotten caught up in something so deadly. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. She nodded. "Why didn't you just take the money and run? With Thomas dead and you inheriting everything, you could have disappeared anywhere in the world. Why stay and fight?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at one of the old photographs on the wall. "You see these men," she said finally, pointing to the moonshine runners. They were criminals, but they were small-time criminals. They made illegal whiskey and sold it to people who wanted to drink. They weren't stealing from charities, they weren't denying medical treatment to sick children, or taking scholarships away from kids who needed them. Her voice grew harder. Victoria Hensley has stolen $8 million from people who needed help. Cancer research that never got funded. Scholarships that were never awarded. Community programs that never got started. How many people suffered because she wanted to buy another house or take another luxury vacation? Marcus understood. This wasn't just about justice for Thomas or even about clearing Elena's name. This was about accountability for crimes that affected thousands of innocent people. Besides, Elena added with a slight smile, Thomas made me promise something before he died. He made me swear that if anything happened to him, I wouldn't let his family destroy everything his grandfather built. The trust was supposed to help people. It's time someone made sure it actually does. The voices outside were growing fainter as the search teams moved farther down the canyon. Pete checked his watch and nodded toward the cave entrance. "Sun's getting low. They'll probably pull back to regroup and plan a night search. This might be our best chance to move." They gathered their minimal supplies and prepared to leave the safety of the cave for the uncertainties of the mountain trails. As they squeezed back through the narrow opening, Marcus caught sight of something that made him pause. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the canyon mouth, but not from the vehicles they'd seen earlier. "Pete," he called softly, "look at this." The old rancher studied the tracks, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Those are from Jake Whitmore's truck. He's been here recently, maybe an hour ago. Think he saw the helicopter. Jake's not blind, and he's not stupid either. If armed men and helicopters are running around his back pasture, he's going to want to know why." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Jake Whitmore was old-school ranch country, the kind of man who believed in helping neighbors and asking questions later. If he'd seen the search operation, he might be willing to provide assistance. "Can we trust him?" Elena asked. "With our lives," Pete said without hesitation. "Jake Whitmore's been fighting the government and big corporations for 40 years. Someone tells him they're chasing innocent people with helicopters. He's going to be on our side just on principle." As they started up the narrow trail that led toward Copper Peak, Marcus realized their situation had changed in ways both good and bad. Victoria Hensley had escalated the conflict beyond anything he'd imagined, bringing in professional hunters and surveillance technology. But they'd also gained potential allies, people who understood that sometimes the law and justice weren't the same thing. The next few hours would determine whether Elena's evidence ever saw the light of day, or whether Victoria Hensley's money and connections would bury the truth as effectively as she'd tried to bury her daughter-in-law. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, following trails that had been worn by cattle and deer and generations of ranchers, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of fighting for something that mattered. Win or lose, he was finally on the right side of a fight that was worth having. The helicopter's sound faded completely as they reached the tree line, but Marcus knew it would be back. Victoria Hensley had invested too much in this hunt to give up easily. The real test was still coming, but for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Marcus believed they might actually win. The abandoned mining camp at Copper Peak looked like something from a ghost story. Collapsed buildings, rusted equipment, and the skeletal remains of a water tower that had probably last held water when Eisenhower was president. But it was perfect cover. invisible from the air and accessible only by trails that required local knowledge to navigate. Safely. Jake Whitmore was waiting for them. The weathered rancher sat on the tailgate of his pickup truck, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a rifle resting across his lap. He was in his 60s, with skin like leather and eyes that missed nothing. When he saw Marcus, Pete, and Elena emerge from the tree line, he nodded once, the kind of greeting that said he'd been expecting them. "Heard you folks were having some trouble with unwelcome visitors," Jake said, pouring coffee into spare cups without waiting for introductions. "Helicopters and such, Jake." Marcus said carefully, "This might not be safe for you to get involved in. Son, I've been ranching this land since before you were born. Had the Forest Service try to run me off. Had mining companies try to steal my water rights. Had corporate lawyers threaten me with lawsuits I couldn't afford to fight. You think I'm scared of some city folks with helicopters?" Pete grinned and accepted a cup of coffee. "Jake, meet Elena Hensley. She's the reason those city folks are so interested in our neighborhood." Jake studied Elena with the careful attention of a man who'd spent his life reading the character of horses and weather patterns. "You're the one they're trying to bury, literally speaking." "Literally speaking," Elena confirmed. "My mother-in-law decided I knew too much about the family business. Well, any enemy of the Hensley family is a friend of mine. Victoria Hensley's been trying to buy up ranch land around here for the past 5 years, offering prices that seem generous until you realize she's planning to strip mine the whole valley for copper." This was news to Marcus. Strip mining, geological surveys, environmental impact studies, the whole 9 yards. She's got backing from some mining consortium out of Denver. Plans to turn 50,000 acres of ranch land into an open-pit mine. Jake spat into the dirt. "Course, she needs to own the land first, and some of us aren't selling." Elena was looking at Jake with new interest. "Do you have documentation of these mining plans, honey?" "I've got a whole filing cabinet full of paperwork from her lawyers, surveyors, and environmental consultants. Been building a case to fight them in court, but court cases cost money I don't have." Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. That's why she needed the trust fund money. She's been stealing from charities to finance a mining operation. $8 million would be a nice down payment on the kind of equipment you'd need, Elena. "Agreed, plus payoffs to local officials, legal fees. Environmental permits. Mining operations require massive upfront investment." Jake set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "You said $8 million, from charity money?" Elena nodded and gave him a brief summary of what she'd discovered about the trust fund theft. By the time she finished, Jake's expression had hardened into something that would have made a rattlesnake nervous. "That woman's been stealing money meant for sick kids and education programs to finance destroying my land." Jake's voice was deadly quiet. "Well, that changes things considerably." Pete checked his watch. "Sun's going down. If we're going to make it to Riverside tonight, we need to start moving soon." "About that," Jake said, "I've been monitoring police radio chatter all afternoon. Victoria Hensley's people have checkpoints on every road between here and Riverside. They're telling law enforcement you're armed and dangerous fugitives, wanted in connection with Thomas Hensley's murder." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "They've turned the whole county against us." "Not the whole county," Jake said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "just the parts that can be bought. But I've got a better idea than trying to sneak past roadblocks." He pulled out a cell phone and dialed a number from memory. "Sarah, it's Jake Whitmore." "Yeah, I'm fine, honey. Listen, I need you to do something unusual tonight, and I can't explain why over the phone. Can you meet me at the bank around midnight? It's important. Trust me on this one, okay?" When he hung up, Elena was staring at him. "Sarah Chen is your niece, my brother's daughter. Smart as a whip, studied finance at Arizona State. Came back home to work at the local bank instead of chasing money in Phoenix. She's been asking me about the Hensley family for months, especially after young Thomas died so sudden. This was an unexpected stroke of luck. Instead of trying to convince a stranger to help them, they now had a family connection who was already suspicious of the Hensley family. But we still have to get to Riverside without being caught," Marcus pointed out. Jake's grin widened. "That's the beauty of it. We're not going to sneak around. We're going to hide in plain sight." 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself squeezed into the cab of Jake's cattle truck. Wearing borrowed ranch clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, Elena was in the sleeper compartment behind the seats. Hidden under a pile of horse blankets and feed sacks, Pete had volunteered to stay behind and create a false trail heading north toward the state border. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked as they approached the first roadblock. "Trust me," Jake said. "I've been hauling cattle to market for 30 years. These boys know me." The roadblock consisted of 2 sheriff's deputies and what looked like private security. Contractors, the same kind of tactical team members they'd seen rappelling from the helicopter. Jake rolled down his window and nodded to the deputies like he encountered roadblocks every day. "Evening, Jake," one of the deputies said. "Running kind of late tonight, aren't you?" "Got a load of cattle for the morning auction in Riverside." Jake replied easily. "Heifers don't care what time it is." The deputy glanced at the cargo area of the truck, where they could hear the shuffling and lowing of actual cattle. "Have you seen anything unusual up your way? We're looking for some fugitives who might be hiding in the hills." "Fugitives?" Jake sounded genuinely surprised. "What kind of fugitives? Armed and dangerous?" "Involved in a murder case. Man named Marcus Sullivan and a woman named Elena Hensley." "Hensley? That wouldn't be related to Victoria Hensley, who's been trying to buy up ranch land around here." The deputy's expression became guarded. "Can't comment on an ongoing investigation, Jake. Just keep your eyes open and call if you see anything suspicious." "Will do, officer." "You boys stay safe out there." The roadblock waved them through without searching the truck. As they drove away, Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "How did you know they wouldn't search the cattle compartment?" "Because nobody wants to climb around in a truck full of nervous cows looking for people who probably aren't there anyway," Jake said. "Besides, half these deputies have known me since they were kids. They're not going to hassle Jake Whitmore over some big city police work." They reached Riverside just after 11 p.m., driving through streets that seemed unnaturally quiet for a Saturday night. Jake parked behind the bank in an alley that was hidden from the main road, but provided quick access to the employee entrance, Sarah's. "Got keys to the whole building," Jake explained. "Perks of being assistant manager. She'll meet us here at midnight." While they waited, Elena used the time to call the FBI field office in Phoenix from Jake's cell phone. She left a detailed message on the after-hours line, explaining who she was, what evidence she possessed, and requesting immediate federal protection. It wasn't much, but it created an official record that might help if things went wrong. At exactly midnight, a small sedan pulled into the alley. Sarah Chen was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 28, with long black hair and the kind of quiet confidence that came from handling other people's money all day. She embraced Jake warmly, then studied Marcus and Elena with professional assessment. "Uncle Jake says you have evidence about the Hensley family stealing money," she said without preamble. $8 million from a charitable trust, plus murder," Elena confirmed. "I have documentation in a safety deposit box here." Sarah nodded. "Boxed 147. I remember when you opened it. Thomas was with you, looked nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm." Her expression darkened. "I never believed he died of natural causes. 31-year-old men don't just drop dead from heart attacks." She led them through the employee entrance into the bank's main vault area. The safety deposit box vault was behind a second set of security doors, but Sarah's manager codes opened everything. Within minutes, they were standing in front of box 247. "I'll need your key," Sarah said. Elena reached into her jacket and pulled out a small brass key that she'd apparently hidden in her clothes throughout their entire ordeal. The box opened to reveal a thick manila folder, several USB drives, and what looked like audio recording equipment. "This is everything," Elena said, spreading the contents on a nearby table. Bank records, insurance documents, recorded conversations, with Victoria admitting to the theft, even Thomas's notes about what he'd discovered. Sarah examined the documents with the trained eye of a financial professional. "This is enough to put her away for life," she said finally. "Multiple felonies, millions in damages, probably RICO charges for organized criminal activity, assuming We can get it to someone who can't be bought, Marcus said. About that, Sarah replied. I made some calls after Uncle Jake contacted me. There's an FBI agent in Phoenix who's been investigating financial crimes in this region for the past year. Agent Rebecca Torres. She's clean, she's thorough, and she specifically requested any information about irregularities involving charitable trusts, as if summoned by the mention of her name. Marcus heard the sound of vehicles pulling into the alley outside. Multiple engines, moving fast. The screech of tires on asphalt. That's not the FBI, Jake said grimly, looking out through a small window. That's our friends from the helicopter. Victoria Hensley had found them. Marcus could see tactical teams deploying around the building, professional movements in the glow of streetlights. They'd been tracked here, probably through cell phone signals or by monitoring bank security systems. Is there another way out? Marcus asked. Employee parking garage connects to the building next door, Sarah said. But they'll have that covered too. Elena was gathering the documents, stuffing everything back into the manila folder. We just need to get this evidence to Agent Torres. Nothing else matters. How? Marcus asked. They've got us surrounded. Sarah pulled out her cell phone. Because bank vaults have landline connections for emergencies, and those lines can't be tapped without a federal warrant. She dialed a number from memory. Agent Torres? This is Sarah Chen, assistant manager at First National Bank in Riverside. I'm calling about the charitable trust investigation. Yes, I have evidence. A lot of evidence. We're at the bank now, but we're about to be arrested by people working for the suspects. Boxed 147, yes. How quickly can you get here? The sound of breaking glass came from the main banking floor. Victoria Hensley's people were coming in fast and hard, not bothering with subtlety anymore. 20 minutes, Sarah said, hanging up. FBI's 20 minutes out. We don't have 20 minutes, Marcus said. Hearing boots on the marble floor of the main banking area, Jake checked his rifle and took position by the vault door. Then we hold them here for 20 minutes. Elena looked at the three people who'd risked everything to help her. Marcus, who'd chosen conscience over money. Jake, who'd stood up to corporate bullies his whole life. And Sarah, who was risking her career to see justice done. I'm sorry I got you all into this, she said. Marcus took her hand. Nobody got us into anything. We chose to be here. The vault door started to open. The final confrontation was about to begin. The first tactical team member through the vault door never saw Jake's rifle coming. The old rancher moved with surprising speed for a man his age, using the butt of his weapon like a club and dropping the intruder before he could raise his own gun. But three more were right behind him, and the narrow vault doorway became a brutal choke point where desperation met professional training. Marcus grabbed a heavy metal document tray and hurled it at the second man, catching him in the chest and sending him stumbling backward into his teammates. Sarah had activated the bank's silent alarm system, which meant local law enforcement would arrive soon, though whether that would help or hurt depended on how many of them were on Victoria Hensley's payroll. FBI's 15 minutes out, Sarah called, crouched behind a desk with her cell phone pressed to her ear. Agent Torres is coordinating with federal marshals from Phoenix. Elena was pressed against the far wall of the vault, clutching the manila folder that contained 8 years of evidence against Victoria Hensley. Everything they'd fought for, everything Thomas had died for, was in that folder. If it was destroyed or fell into the wrong hands, the Hensley family would walk away clean and continue stealing from charities, while planning to strip mine half the county. The tactical team was regrouping for another assault when a new voice cut through the chaos. Victoria Hensley herself, standing in the bank's main lobby with Charles Brennan and David Hensley flanking her like bodyguards. Enough. Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Stand down, all of you. The tactical team members lowered their weapons, but maintained their positions. Marcus could see Victoria through the vault doorway, impeccably dressed even at midnight, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the circumstances. She looked like she was attending a board meeting, not orchestrating a break-in at gunpoint. Mr. Sullivan, Victoria called out conversationally. Miss Chen, Mr. Whitmore, and dear Elena. Of course, I believe we need to discuss terms. The only terms I'm interested in discussing, Jake replied, keeping his rifle trained on the doorway, involve you spending the rest of your life in federal prison. Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Mr. Whitmore, you're a rancher. You understand practical realities. I'm offering everyone in that vault a very generous settlement in exchange for certain documents that belong to my family. They don't belong to your family, Elena said, stepping forward despite Marcus's attempt to keep her back. They document crimes against charitable organizations and evidence of Thomas's murder. Thomas died of a heart attack brought on by the stress of discovering his wife's embezzlement. Victoria replied smoothly, that's what the coroner's report states, and that's what any investigation will conclude. As for the trust fund, I'm prepared to make full restitution plus damages. Everyone wins. Charles Brennan stepped forward, pulling out a briefcase. I have settlement agreements for each of you. $1 million in exchange for your silence and the return of any documents in your possession, tax-free, paid into accounts of your choosing, available immediately. It was a sophisticated play, Marcus realized. Rather than risk a prolonged legal battle with uncertain outcomes, Victoria was trying to buy them off, with amounts large enough to be life-changing for ordinary people. $1 million would save his ranch 10 times over. For Jake, it would mean never having to worry about losing his land to lawyers and mining companies. For Sarah, it could mean early retirement and financial independence. Mr. Sullivan, Victoria continued, you're facing foreclosure in less than 30 days. This money could solve all your problems. Mr. Whitmore, I'm also prepared to offer you fair market value for your ranch, plus relocation assistance. Ms. Chen, there's a position available at our corporate banking division in Denver with a starting salary of $200,000 per year. Even Elena wasn't immune to the offer. And for you, dear, Victoria said, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone, I'm prepared to discuss a very generous interpretation of Thomas's will. The insurance money, the trust fund distributions, even a position on our board of directors. You could honor Thomas's memory by working within the system instead of trying to destroy it. The silence in the vault stretched for nearly a minute. Marcus could hear sirens in the distance, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Local law enforcement, but also the possibility of federal agents arriving early. Sarah was the first to break the silence. $1 million, she said thoughtfully. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. Victoria smiled. Exactly. Practical solutions to practical problems. There's just one issue with your offer. Sarah continued, her voice growing harder. It assumes we're all criminals like you. It assumes we can be bought. She stood up, no longer hiding behind the desk. I've spent the last hour reviewing your financial records. Mrs. Hensley, do you know what $8 million could have been funded? Medical research that might have saved my cousin's life. Scholarships for kids like me who couldn't afford college without help. Community programs that could have kept teenagers off the streets and out of gangs. Sarah's voice was rising now, years of quiet anger finally finding expression. You didn't just steal money, you stole hope. You stole futures. You stole lives. Jake lowered his rifle and stepped beside Sarah. I've been fighting corporate thieves my whole life, lady. You think I'm going to start working for them now? Marcus looked at Elena, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. $1 million. Financial security. The end of all his problems. Marcus, she said quietly. Whatever you decide, I'll understand. He thought about his grandfather, about deadwood and new growth, about the choices that defined who a person really was when everything else was stripped away. He thought about the man he'd been 3 days ago, bitter, isolated, ready to do almost anything for money. And he thought about the man he'd become since then, someone who'd chosen to protect a stranger, someone who'd discovered that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Keep your money, Marcus said. All of it. Victoria's composed expression flickered for just a moment. Mr. Sullivan, I don't think you understand the magnitude of what you're refusing. I understand perfectly. You're offering me money to help you cover up the theft of money meant for people who needed it more than I do. The answer is no. The sirens were getting closer now. Through the bank's front windows, Marcus could see flashing lights reflecting off the buildings across the street. Multiple vehicles, moving fast. Elena stepped forward, holding up the manila folder. "Mrs. Hensley, I have recordings of you admitting to the theft. I have bank records showing transfers to personal accounts. I have insurance documents proving Thomas was worth more to you dead than alive, and I have the names of every charity that was supposed to receive money you stole." She paused, then delivered the final blow. "I also have documentation of your mining operation, including environmental impact studies that were falsified and bribes paid to local officials. The FBI is going to be very interested in that evidence." Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. The polite, businesslike demeanor vanished, replaced by cold rage that transformed her face into something Marcus had never seen before. "You stupid girl," she hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me? What have you cost this family?" "I know exactly what I've cost you," Elena replied. "Everything you stole." The front doors of the bank burst open as federal agents poured in, followed by local sheriff's deputies, who looked confused about whose jurisdiction they were operating under. Agent Rebecca Torres was immediately identifiable, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of authoritative presence that filled a room. "Victoria Hensley," Agent Torres called out, her voice carrying clearly through the bank. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and violations of federal environmental protection statutes." The tactical team members were already dropping their weapons and identifying themselves as private security contractors who claimed they'd been told they were pursuing dangerous fugitives. Charles Brennan was frantically making phone calls to lawyers and political contacts. David Hensley was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands, apparently having a nervous breakdown. But Victoria Hensley wasn't finished. "This isn't over," she said, her eyes fixed on Elena as the federal agents moved to arrest her. "You think you've won something, but you have no idea what you've started. The Hensley family has resources, connections, influence that goes far beyond what you can imagine." Agent Torres stepped between Victoria and Elena. "Mrs. Hensley, you have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." As the FBI led Victoria away in handcuffs, Marcus found himself standing in the aftermath of the most intense week of his life. The bank vault was a wreck. There were bullet holes in the walls, and his entire world had been turned upside down. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt like he could breathe freely. "So what happens now?" he asked Agent Torres. "Now we process the evidence, build the case, and make sure justice is served," she replied. "The three of you will need to provide detailed statements, and there will probably be a trial where you'll need to testify. But based on what I've seen tonight, this case is going to result in significant prison time for everyone involved." Elena was standing apart from the group, looking out through the bank's front windows at the dawn light beginning to creep over the mountains. Marcus walked over to join her. "You all right?" he asked. She turned to him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked truly peaceful. "Thomas used to say that the hardest part about doing the right thing is that you don't always know what the right thing is. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a situation where the choice is clear." Marcus understood. "What will you do now?" "Rebuild the trust fund. Make sure it actually helps people this time. And maybe," she hesitated, then smiled, "maybe I'll stick around Copper Valley for a while. I hear there's good ranch land available." Marcus looked out at the mountains, thinking about his grandfather's ranch, about the bank notices in his pocket that would need to be dealt with, about the future that suddenly seemed possible again. "Good ranch land's hard to come by," he said, "but if you know the right people, if you're willing to work hard and do things the right way, you can build something worth having." Elena took his hand. "I think I'd like that." 6 months later, Marcus stood on his porch watching the sun set over a valley that looked different than it had before. His cattle were back, the mortgage was current, and the ranch was thriving again. But the biggest change wasn't in the land or the livestock, it was in himself. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. Victoria Hensley received 25 years in federal prison. Charles Brennan got 15 years. David Hensley, who cooperated with prosecutors and testified against his mother, received 5 years probation and was required to make full restitution to the charities his family had robbed. The mining operation was permanently shut down. The affected land was designated as a conservation area, and Jake Whitmore was hired as the area's environmental protection coordinator. Sarah Chen had been promoted to bank president after her role in exposing the Hensley conspiracy became public knowledge. She'd also started a foundation to help small ranchers fight corporate land grabs, and Elena had kept her promise. The Hensley Family Trust was re-established with proper oversight, and for the first time in 15 years, it was actually funding the medical research, scholarships, and community programs it was supposed to support. She'd also kept her other promise about staying in Copper Valley. The small house she'd built on land adjacent to Marcus's ranch was visible from his porch, and he could see lights in her kitchen windows as she prepared dinner. Pete emerged from the barn, moving more slowly than he used to, but still refusing to admit he was getting old. "You planning to stand there all evening? Or are you going to walk over there and ask that woman to marry you?" Marcus grinned. "You think she'd say yes, son? That woman followed you through mine tunnels and gunfights. I'm pretty sure she's not going anywhere." As Marcus walked across the pasture toward Elena's house, he thought about choices and consequences, about the difference between surviving and living, about the strange ways life could surprise a person who thought he had nothing left to lose. He'd started this story as a man desperate enough to bury a stranger for money. He was ending it as someone who'd learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or sold. They had to be earned through the choices you made when everything was on the line. Some people, Marcus realized, spent their whole lives waiting for a second chance. He'd been lucky enough to recognize his when it came, even if it had arrived wrapped in mystery and danger and a woman who refused to stay buried. The future stretched out ahead of them like an unwritten story, full of possibilities that felt as endless as the desert sky above Copper Valley. And for the first time in years, Marcus Sullivan was looking forward to finding out how it would end. 2 years after Victoria Hensley's conviction, Marcus Sullivan stood in the boardroom of the newly renovated Hensley Foundation headquarters in Phoenix, watching Elena address a room full of charity directors, medical researchers, and scholarship recipients. The woman speaking confidently about education funding and cancer research bore little resemblance to the bruised, drugged victim he'd pulled from a makeshift grave in the desert. The Thomas Hensley Memorial Research Grant has allocated $2.3 million this year to childhood cancer studies, Elena was saying, her voice carrying easily through the large room. "We're also proud to announce that our scholarship program has expanded to include students from 15 additional rural districts across Arizona and New Mexico." Marcus felt a familiar surge of pride watching her work. In the past 24 months, Elena had transformed the corrupted Hensley Family Trust into something that actually honored its original mission. The foundation now operated with complete transparency, independent oversight, and a board of directors that included community leaders, medical professionals, and former scholarship recipients. But success came with its own complications. After the meeting ended and the last attendees had filtered out, Elena's assistant, a sharp young woman named Maria Santos, approached with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Sullivan," Maria said, using the name Elena had taken after her marriage to Marcus 6 months earlier, "we've received another one of those letters." Elena's smile faded as she accepted the envelope Maria handed her. It was expensive stationery, cream-colored with embossed letterhead, but Marcus could see the tension in Elena's shoulders as she read the contents. "What is it?" he asked. "Legal challenge to the foundation's tax-exempt status," Elena said, passing him the letter, "the third one this month. Someone's trying to tie us up in court battles and regulatory reviews." Marcus scanned the document, though the legal terminology was mostly beyond him. What he understood was the signature at the bottom: Brennan, Walsh and Associates. Charles Brennan might be in federal prison, but his former law firm was apparently continuing his work. "Can they do this?" Marcus asked. "They can try," Elena replied. "Tax law is complicated enough that a determined opponent can create problems, even when they have no legal standing." The goal isn't to win, it's to drain our resources fighting frivolous lawsuits until we can't afford to operate. Maria pulled out a tablet and showed them a series of news articles. It's not just legal challenges. There's also been a coordinated media campaign questioning the foundation's management and suggesting that Mrs. Sullivan is profiting from her husband's death. The headlines were professionally crafted character assassination innuendo disguised as investigative journalism, questions about Elena's qualifications, suggestions that the foundation was being mismanaged. None of it was actionable slander, but it was designed to erode public confidence and donor support. "Who's behind this?" Marcus asked. "That's what we need to find out," Elena said. She walked to the window overlooking downtown Phoenix, her reflection showing the exhaustion she tried to hide from foundation staff and beneficiaries. Victoria Hensley is in federal prison, but she had connections we never fully identified. People who benefited from her mining operation, politicians who took her money, business partners who had investments in the corruption. Marcus joined her at the window. 2 years of marriage had taught him to read the subtle signs of her stress, the way she held her shoulders, the slight tension around her eyes, the unconscious gesture of touching the scar on her throat where the rope burns, had finally faded. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Before Elena could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Chen's name. "Sarah," Elena answered on speaker. "How are things in Riverside?" Sarah's voice was tight with worry. "Elena, we need to talk. Something's happening here that you need to know about." "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves federal agents asking questions about foundation financial records and whether you've been diverting money for personal use." The room went silent. Marcus felt the familiar chill of danger, the same instinct that had kept him alive during their confrontation with Victoria Hensley. "Who's making these accusations?" Elena asked. "That's the strange part. The agents won't say, but they have detailed financial records that someone had to provide from inside the foundation. Transaction records, budget allocations, even copies of board meeting minutes that aren't public." Marcus and Elena exchanged glances. Someone with internal access was feeding information to people who wanted to destroy the foundation. "Sarah, can you find out which agents are handling this? We need to know if this is a legitimate investigation or something else." "I'll try, but Elena, be careful. Whoever is doing this has serious resources and connections. This isn't just about money anymore." After hanging up, Marcus found himself thinking about patterns and timing. The legal challenges had started 3 months ago, right after the foundation announced its largest funding commitment ever, a $50 million initiative to build medical research facilities in underserved rural areas. "Elena," he said slowly, "what if this isn't about revenge? What if it's about the money you're giving away?" She turned from the window, her analytical mind already following his logic. "You think someone wants to stop the rural medical initiative? I think someone benefits when rural areas don't have access to quality health care, when people have to travel hundreds of miles for cancer treatment or specialized surgery, when communities can't attract doctors because they don't have modern facilities." Maria was nodding, her fingers flying across her tablet screen. "I've been tracking the opposition to our rural medical proposal. There's been pushback from 3 major hospital corporations to pharmaceutical companies and a medical insurance consortium. They've all argued that rural medical facilities would be financially unsustainable." Or Elena said grimly, "They're worried about competition cutting into their profits." Marcus thought about the small towns scattered across Arizona and New Mexico, places where people drove for hours to see a specialist or went without treatment because they couldn't afford the travel and time off work. The Foundation's Rural Medical Initiative would change that, bringing advanced health care to communities that had been medically underserved for generations. "How much money are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "For the healthcare corporations, potentially hundreds of millions in lost revenue if rural communities stop having to use their facilities," Maria said. "For pharmaceutical companies, it could mean increased competition and price pressure. For insurance companies, it might mean they can't justify higher premiums in rural areas." Elena sat down heavily in one of the boardroom chairs. "So we're not just fighting Victoria Hensley's legacy. We're fighting an entire industry that profits from keeping healthcare inaccessible, which explains why they're not trying to kill you this time. Marcus said, they're trying to destroy your credibility and shut down the foundation legally. Much cleaner than murder. Maria's tablet chimed with an incoming message. She read it, and her face went pale. What is it? Elena asked. The IRS just announced they're conducting a comprehensive audit of the foundation's tax-exempt status there, requesting 7 years of financial records, including records from before Mrs. Sullivan took control. Marcus felt the walls closing in. An IRS audit could take years and cost millions in legal fees, effectively shutting down the foundation's operations while the investigation continued. Even if they were eventually cleared, the Rural Medical Initiative would be dead, along with dozens of other programs that depended on donor confidence. There's more, Maria continued. I just received resignation letters from 3 board members, citing concerns about potential legal liability. And our largest corporate donor just canceled their annual contribution. The coordinated nature of the attack was becoming clear. Legal challenges, media manipulation, federal investigation, board defections, and donor withdrawal all happening simultaneously to maximize damage and minimize the foundation's ability to respond. Professional reputation destruction, Elena said quietly. Someone hired experts. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Whitmore. Need to see you both. Found something you should know about. Come to the ranch tonight. As they drove back to Copper Valley that evening, Marcus found himself thinking about the difference between the direct violence they'd faced from Victoria Hensley and the sophisticated legal warfare now being waged against them. Both were attempts to silence Elena and shut down her work, but this new approach was potentially more dangerous because it was harder to fight. You know what bothers me most about this? Elena said as they turned onto the dirt road leading to Jake's ranch. What? Victoria Hensley stole $8 million from charities, and we stopped her. But now we're being attacked for trying to give $50 million to communities that need it. The system is designed to reward theft and punish generosity. Jake Whitmore was waiting for them on his porch, but he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was Agent Rebecca Torres, the FBI investigator who had arrested Victoria Hensley 2 years earlier. Agent Torres, Marcus said as they approached, this is unexpected. Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan. Torres stood and shook their hands. Jake called me because he thought you should hear this directly rather than through official channels. Jake gestured for them to sit down. Tell them what you told me, Rebecca. Agent Torres opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. 3 weeks ago, the FBI received a complaint alleging that the Hensley Foundation was being used to launder money from illegal mining operations. The complaint included detailed financial records and suggested that Mrs. Sullivan was continuing her late mother-in-law's criminal activities. Elena's face went white. That's impossible. Every transaction is documented and audited. We have complete transparency. I know, Torres said, because I've spent the last 3 weeks investigating the complaint. It's completely fabricated, sophisticated, enough to fool a casual review, but obviously fake to anyone who understands how money laundering actually works. She handed Elena a document. The complaint was filed by a shell company that traces back to a law firm in Denver, the same law firm that represents Consolidated Healthcare Solutions, Western Pharmaceutical Partners, and Mountain States Insurance Group. Marcus recognized those names from Maria's research. The companies that oppose the Rural Medical Initiative. Exactly. But here's the interesting part. The complaint was filed the day before the foundation announced the $50 million rural medical commitment. Someone knew about your plans before they were made public. The implication was clear. Someone inside the foundation, someone with access to board meeting minutes and strategic planning documents, was feeding information to their opponents. Who? Elena asked. That's what we need to figure out, Torres said, because whoever it is has access to your most sensitive information and is coordinating with people who have significant resources to destroy your work. Jake leaned forward in his chair. There's something else. Over the past month, I've had 3 different people approach me about selling my ranch, all cash offers, well above market value, no inspections required. when I asked why they were so interested in my particular piece of land. They said they were developing a regional medical complex. Marcus felt pieces clicking together. They want your land for the same reason Victoria Hensley wanted its location. Your ranch sits on the main water source for this whole valley. And if they control the water, Elena said, they can control any development in the region, including where medical facilities get built. Agent Torres nodded. We think the attack on the Foundation is just one part of a larger strategy. They're trying to eliminate competition, control resources, and maintain their monopoly on healthcare in rural markets. So what do we do, Marcus asked. We set a trap, Torres said. Give the insider false information and see where it leads. But first, we need to identify who at the Foundation has access to confidential board documents. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape where her nightmare had begun. 2 years earlier, when she spoke, her voice carried the same determination Marcus had heard. When she'd refused Victoria Hensley's $1 million bribe. They picked the wrong fight, she said. Victoria Hensley tried to bury me to cover up theft. These people are trying to bury me to prevent healing. Either way, they don't understand that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what it costs. Marcus took her hand. Then we fight. But this time, Agent Torres added, we fight smart, and we make sure that when it's over, no one else can continue what Victoria Hensley started. As they sat on Jake's porch watching the sun set over the valley that had become their battleground, Marcus realized that their story wasn't over, it was just beginning a new chapter. They'd survived assassination attempts and corporate corruption, but now they faced something potentially more dangerous, a system designed to prevent people from helping each other. But they'd learned something important in their first battle. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against overwhelming odds wasn't money or connections, or superior firepower. Sometimes it was just the refusal to give up. And Marcus Sullivan and Elena Sullivan had gotten very good at refusing to give up. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Agent Torres had suggested they create 3 different versions of a confidential Foundation document, each containing false information about the timing and location of a major funding announcement, but each version given to only one person with access to board materials. Whichever false information showed up in the hands of their corporate enemies would identify their mole. Marcus sat in the Foundation's conference room at dawn, watching through security cameras as Maria Santos arrived early for work, as she had every day for the past 18 months. Elena was monitoring the phones from another room, while Agent Torres tracked digital communications from an FBI surveillance van parked across the street. They'd given Maria the false information about a secret meeting with rural hospital administrators and flag staff. Board member Dr. Patricia Reeves had received details about a supposed partnership with a Canadian pharmaceutical company, and Foundation Treasurer Robert Chensera's uncle had been told about plans to accelerate the Rural Medical Initiative with emergency funding from a private donor. Movement on the Flagstaff information. Torres's voice crackled through Marcus's earpiece. Someone just made a call from inside the building to a Denver number registered to Consolidated Healthcare Solutions. Marcus felt his stomach sink. Maria had been with them since the Foundation's rebirth, had worked late nights and weekends to help distribute millions in charitable funding. If she was the traitor, it meant their enemies had been watching their every move for over a year. Confirmed. Elena's voice came through the comm system. Maria just called in sick and left the building. She's moving fast toward the parking garage. Through the conference room window, Marcus could see Maria's small sedan speeding out of the parking garage with unusual urgency. Torres's surveillance team would follow her, but they already had what they needed: proof of who was feeding information to their enemies. Why? Marcus asked aloud, knowing Maria couldn't hear him. We trusted her. We helped her family when her brother needed surgery. Sometimes money talks louder than loyalty, Torres's voice replied in his earpiece. We'll know more when we bring her in. But Maria Santos would never make it to whatever meeting she was rushing toward. 3 blocks from the Foundation building, her sedan was intercepted by FBI agents and local police. The arrest was swift, professional, and final. 2 hours later, Marcus and Elena sat across from Maria in an FBI interrogation room, watching the young woman they'd trusted destroy her own life. With every word she spoke, they approached me 6 months ago, Maria said, tears streaming down her face. My mother needed experimental cancer treatment that wasn't covered by insurance. Consolidated Healthcare offered to pay for everything: the treatment, the travel, the time off work. All I had to do was keep them informed about foundation activities. So you sold out programs that help people like your mother, Elena said quietly. You sabotaged medical research funding to pay for medical treatment. They said the foundation was wasting money on projects that would never work. They said rural medical facilities were financially impossible, that the money would be better spent on proven urban hospitals. Maria's voice was barely a whisper. They made it sound like I was helping people by stopping a doomed project. Marcus thought about the sophisticated lies that had convinced Maria to betray everything she'd worked for. Corporate manipulation at its finest, taking someone's desperation and twisting it into a weapon against their own interests. What did you tell them? Agent Torres asked. Everything. Board meeting minutes, funding decisions, strategic plans, donor information. They said they needed to understand the foundation's operations to make sure their own charitable giving was effective. Maria looked up at Elena with broken eyes. I never thought they were trying to destroy you. I thought they were trying to help. Agent Torres slid a document across the table. Maria, this is a cooperation agreement. If you're willing to help us expose the full scope of this conspiracy, the prosecutor might be willing to discuss reduced charges. What Maria revealed over the next 3 hours was staggering in its scope and calculation. Consolidated Healthcare Solutions hadn't just been gathering intelligence about the foundation. They'd been orchestrating a systematic campaign to eliminate competition in rural healthcare markets across the Southwest. The legal challenges, media attacks, and federal investigations targeting the Hensley Foundation were just one piece of a larger strategy that included buying up rural hospitals, driving independent doctors out of business, and creating healthcare deserts where patients had no choice but to use corporate facilities. They have a 5-year plan, Maria explained, reading from notes she'd kept. Control healthcare delivery in every community with less than 50,000 people. Between Denver and Phoenix, eliminate independent hospitals, rural clinics, and any charitable organizations that might provide alternative funding. How many other foundations are they targeting? Elena asked. 17 that I know of. Medical research charities, community health organizations, even children's hospitals that serve rural areas. They're using the same playbook: internal sabotage, legal challenges, regulatory investigations, media manipulation. Marcus felt a cold understanding settle over him. This wasn't just about the Hensley Foundation or even about rural medical access. This was about corporate control of healthcare on a massive scale, using legal and financial weapons to eliminate anyone who threatened their monopoly. But we can stop them, Agent Torres said. With Maria's cooperation and the evidence we've gathered, we can expose the entire conspiracy and shut down their operations. The next phase moved with the speed and precision of a federal law enforcement operation that had been months in the planning. Armed with Maria's inside knowledge and communications records, FBI agents simultaneously raided offices in Denver, Phoenix, Albuquerque, and Salt Lake City. The raids uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond healthcare corporations. Politicians had been bribed to support legislation that favored corporate hospitals. Regulatory officials had been paid to target charitable organizations. Media companies had been given advertising contracts in exchange for negative coverage of rural healthcare initiatives. Within 72 hours, 18 people were under federal indictment, including the CEOs of 3 major healthcare corporations, 2 state legislators, and a federal regulatory official who'd been fast-tracking investigations against charitable foundations. Marcus watched the news coverage from the foundation's conference room, amazed at how quickly the corporate empire had crumbled once its methods were exposed. Federal prosecutors were calling it the largest healthcare fraud conspiracy in U.S. history. How did we get so lucky? He asked Elena, who was reading through legal documents that would clear the foundation of all regulatory challenges. It wasn't luck, she replied. Maria kept detailed records of everything they asked her to do, probably without realizing she was documenting federal crimes. And Agent Torres had been tracking similar patterns across multiple states. We just gave them the missing piece. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the surgical wing of the newly opened Copper Valley Regional Medical Center, the first facility funded by the Foundation's Rural Medical Initiative. The hospital was exactly what they'd envisioned: modern equipment, specialized departments, and staff recruited from major urban medical centers who'd been attracted by the opportunity to serve underserved communities. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the center's chief of surgery, was giving them a tour of the facility that corporate interests had tried so hard to prevent. We've already performed 3 emergency surgeries that would have required helicopter transport to Phoenix, Dr. Mitchell explained as they walked through the cardiac care unit. For rural communities, that's the difference between life and death. Elena paused by a window overlooking the valley, where her ordeal had begun 3 years earlier. Thomas would have loved this, she said quietly. He always believed that helping people was more important than making money. Marcus joined her at the window. In the distance, he could see Jake Whitmore's ranch, where the old man was now training a new generation of environmental protection specialists. Pete had finally retired, but served as a volunteer guide for students studying desert ecology. Sarah Chen had been promoted to regional bank president and was developing innovative lending programs for rural healthcare facilities. What about Maria? Marcus asked. She's testifying in the federal trial next month, Elena replied. Her cooperation led to plea agreements for several defendants and helped secure convictions for the conspiracy leaders. She'll serve 18 months in federal prison, but her information probably saved dozens of healthcare charities from being destroyed. Agent Torres appeared in the hallway, wearing civilian clothes, but still carrying herself with the authority of federal law enforcement. Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, she said, approaching them. I wanted to give you an update on the final prosecutions. Good news, I hope, Elena asked. The best. Consolidated Healthcare Solutions has agreed to a settlement that includes $2 billion in fines and the establishment of a federal fund for rural healthcare development. Their executives are facing prison sentences that range from 8 to 25 years. Marcus whistled softly. $2 billion, which will be administered by a consortium of charitable foundations, including yours. Torres continued. The court specifically cited the Hensley Foundation's work as a model for how rural healthcare funding should be managed. As they walked through the hospital's children's wing, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a desperate man willing to bury a stranger for money, and it had ended with a healthcare system that would serve thousands of people who'd never had access to quality medical care before. There's one more thing, Torres said as they reached the hospital's main lobby. The Justice Department is creating a new task force to investigate corporate manipulation of charitable organizations. They've asked if you'd be willing to serve as civilian consultants. Elena looked at Marcus, and he could see the same spark in her eyes that had driven her to fight Victoria Hensley's corruption 3 years earlier. How many other foundations are being attacked? She asked. Preliminary investigation suggests dozens, maybe hundreds. Healthcare is just one sector we've found similar patterns, targeting environmental charities, education foundations, even disaster relief organizations. Marcus understood what Torres was really asking. They'd won this battle, but there was a larger war being fought between corporate greed and charitable giving, between profit and public service, between people who wanted to help and people who wanted to control. We'll do it, Elena said without hesitation. But we have conditions. Name them. Full federal protection for foundation staff and board members, independent oversight of any investigations, and complete transparency about which government officials have conflicts of interest. Torres smiled. Done. When can you start? As they left the hospital that evening, driving back toward the ranch that had become their permanent home, Marcus reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day in the desert, when he'd chosen conscience over money. The Hensley Foundation now managed over $100 million in charitable assets. Rural medical facilities were under construction in 12 states. Educational scholarships were sending hundreds of students to college every year. Medical research funding was supporting breakthrough treatments for diseases that disproportionately affected rural communities. But perhaps most importantly, they'd proven that ordinary people could fight corporate corruption and win if they were willing to risk everything for what was right. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked as they pulled into their driveway. Elena leaned against his shoulder, watching the stars emerge over the desert sky. "Just one." "What's that?" "I wish Thomas could have seen this. He would have been so proud of what the foundation has become." Marcus thought about the young man who died trying to expose his family's corruption, whose death had set in motion everything that followed. "I think he did see it. And I think he'd say the same thing your grandfather would have said: sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters." As they sat on their porch that night, Marcus realized their story had come full circle. It had started with death and burial, but it had ended with life and healing. It had begun with corruption and greed, but it had concluded with justice and generosity. Most importantly, it had transformed to broken people into partners in something larger than themselves, a mission to make sure that helping others was always more powerful than exploiting them. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and promise across the valley, and somewhere in the distance, the lights of the new medical center glowed like a beacon against the darkness. Proof that sometimes the good guys really do win, but only if they're willing to fight for it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.